Hi, Jim, and I was retired, and I'm on the banks of the Cooper on the eve of the NCAA rowing championships this time. I'm out here because I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of DIY retirement planning. Stay tuned. Now, there are three pros for my DIY approach, and the first one is really why I built it in the first place, and that's because I can understand the formula that are going into the assumptions. When I first was retired 7 years ago, I looked at some online alternatives, but I couldn't always understand how they were coming up with the numbers. And so I took some online courses and I built a spreadsheet from scratch so I can understand the assumptions that were being made. And so that is the first pro of a DIY approach. You know what goes into it. Now, the second pro of the approach is that I have a column for every income source during retirement, for the pension and Social Securities, and for my IRAs and 401ks and Roth accounts, brokerage accounts and savings accounts. All of them have a separate column. It's looking at each income stream and making projections of the income it will generate and the taxes it will generate each year. Some online plans lump everything together and say take a 4% of that and that's what you can use in retirement. It's not a very strategic approach, and so that's the second advantage of this DIY approach. I'm not paying anybody for this, I'm doing it myself. And so that's the third pro of a DIY approach. But there are some negatives in a DIY approach. The first one was pointed out to me by a viewer who noted that I'm using an average COLA for Social Security. And yes, I'm using averages based on past experience in some of my assumptions for future years. And so I'm using an average COLA of 2.5% for Social Security. And yes, that will vary widely each year, but on average it should be 2.5. And he pointed out you should probably just use a random number to come up with your COLA each year, maybe within a range, and certainly you could do that formula. But you'd also, to be a true Monte Carlo approach, have to repeat that exercise for about 1,000 times and then look at your success rate. So that looked a little bit too beyond what I could do in my DIY approach. So the assumptions that I'm using based on averages of the past is one con of my DIY approach, and if there are alternatives, I'm going to look for that. The second negative or con of my DIY approach is that there's one row for each year, and for Social Security and pensions, it matters when you take a pension mid-year. So unless you go in and manually change the numbers for those rows to accurately reflect the income source for a partial year, you may be off. But overall, I felt that was a con I could live with. I could adjust those. And the third con for the DIY approach is that I'm using that average return, and again, it's a real rate of return based on a compounded annual growth rate, or CAGR. So it's a conservative estimate. I'm not using the averages. I'm using a compounded annual growth rate, which smooths out the averages, and I'm using real rates adjusted for inflation. So those are cons that I'm trying to deal with by being conservative. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow you to use a different return for each income stream. So if you're heavily invested in equity, you might want to put in a higher return. And if you're in safe bonds, you may want to use a lower return. So the ability to customize returns per investment column would be an advantage, a growth opportunity for this approach. If the online models can do that, that would be an advantage as well. It's also not taking into account your asset allocation. Now in my case, I have a whole separate spreadsheet that looks at my portfolio by buckets 3 time buckets and 3 tax buckets. And I look at my asset allocation on that spreadsheet, but I don't do it here. And I'm using an overall return for that investment portfolio in this spreadsheet. So if there's a way of improving that, that's something else I'm looking at. Now, it's all about getting better and better with practice. The women are out here practicing for tomorrow's NCAA rowing championships. And you may be asking, why aren't there men in the NCAA rowing championships? Rowing is one of those sports that's only recognized for women in the NCAA. Men have different competitions like the IRA. The women, this is the top of the game in college rowing. NCAA championships, and it's here on the Cooper, and we're so lucky. So they're practicing today for heats tomorrow and finals on Saturday for Division I, Division II, and Division III rowing championships. This is where it all comes to the finish line, and I wish them all luck. Now, in the coming weeks, I will be looking at both the empowerment personal capital model, which I've used for about 5 years, and new retirement, which I've used for about 4 years. And I think what I'm going to do, instead of doing a tutorial on either one, because there are some fine tutorials out there on these two alternatives, I'm just going to share my assessment of how each deals with some of those issues. Now, I will also likely go look at Schwab's retirement complementary plan, because that's changed recently. I had used it when I first retired, but I haven't used it since then. So I may go back to that as well to see what these online models lack and what they give me compared to my DIY approach. Hey, if you like this, please like and subscribe to this channel. I'm trying to share entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. So if this appeals to you and you're pursuing a DIY retirement, please click below. I'll conclude with my standard warning. I am not a professional. I have no initials after my name. So take these as entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one. See you next week.